Okay, so this is officially being recorded. So welcome to H.O.P.E's second webinar, which is on effective practicing. We're really grateful to have over 75 signups for this, and we're really excited to share with you all the things about practicing today. So our schedule will be like this. We'll first introduce all of our lovely panelists, and our topics will be covering planning for practice, balancing practice, practicing repertoire, and other specific questions. And a lot of you, well, some of you, didn't exactly ask questions related to effective practicing, such as like college admissions and that kind of stuff, but we'll be having future webinars on those to go more in depth on those topics, but those will be covered lightly today, but we'll be focusing on effective practicing. So first, introducing our panelists. First up is Asma. So Asma, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So hey everyone, my name is Asma. I live around Toronto, Canada. I'm going into McGill University next year for a major in biochemistry. So not exactly something in music, but it is probably one of my foremost activities that I do outside of my academics. Not only am I a pianist, but I'm also an aspiring composer, and I also play the trumpet. And some of my other hobbies include like gardening, reading, doing taekwondo. So I like to do a variety of activities, but playing piano is probably one of like the things I do most often in my free time. And I look forward to discussing how to find the time and personal motivation to practice, especially if you have a lot of other academic obligations. But it's nice to meet you all and speak to you today.
Awesome. Okay, so now we're going to introduce Catherine.
Hi everyone, my name is Catherine Huang, and I am an incoming freshman at Harvard from San Jose, California. I plan to major in applied mathematics or computer science while furthering my piano studies in college. My high school musical journey has been full of self-discovery and personal growth, and I'm excited to share what worked and didn't work for me. Over the years, I found that balancing piano with academics is largely a matter of mindset and one's genuine passion for both pursuits. I have loved quantitative problem solving from a young age and had the drive to excel in classes at school, especially math and science ones, and same thing goes for piano. So we all have good and bad days at school and in our practicing, and for me, it was mainly that drive that I had mentioned earlier that kept me going through those rough days and helped me see the big picture of what I really wanted. So to that end, I'm happy to share advice and tips about mindset and attitude, as well as about balancing piano, which includes practicing competitions and performances with a rigorous academic course load.
All right, awesome. Welcome, Catherine. Now we're going to introduce Lucas.
Wow, that's going to be a hard act to follow, but I'll do my best. Anyway, so I'm Lucas. I'm from New York. I'm from New York City. I've been studying at the Juilliard Pre-College for 6 years now, and this fall, I'm going to be attending the New England Conservatory of Music. I'm going to be studying there for a year before I head to Princeton University the following fall. So I'm currently a pianist, but I'm also interested in conducting, in composing, and possibly in chamber music and some other fields of music. I'm also, when I'm not doing music, I'm into reforming public music education and also into political science as well as potentially environmental science. And I also like to run and I like to take naps. So I'm really honored to be a panelist on today's webinar, and I'm looking forward to discussing time management, some nifty methods regarding practice that my teacher has taught me when I've studied with him for 6 years now, and he's given me some really wonderful and helpful tips. So I look forward to sharing that with all of you.
Okay, great. Okay, so now our final panelist we're going to introduce today is Hannah.
Hey, hello everyone. My name is Hannah Lynn, and currently I'm a rising sophomore studying mechanical engineering and minoring in musicology at UCLA. So this is my 13th year playing piano. I also play a little bit of cello on the side, and in my free time I enjoy a lot of photography and baking. So my music career, as for many of us, it has been a very meaningful journey for me. So I'm super excited to be here and talk to you guys, answer any questions you have, whether it's about academics, time management, or motivation. So thank you for being here and look forward to talking to you.
Okay, so now we're gonna move on officially to practice, planning your practice and how to do that well, I guess. So our first question that was submitted for this webinar was, can you do a walkthrough of how you practice? For example, let's say you practice scales first for 20 minutes and then technique for 30 minutes and then your pieces for 30 minutes. So what are your personal takes on this and how do you structure your practice? So our order of panelists speaking will be Asma and then Hannah, then Lucas and Catherine.
Great. So I guess I'll start off with just a vague description of how I like to check my practice time, as I know a lot of the further questions will go into more specific things. But in general, I like to start with, of course, warm-up. So how I usually like to warm up is not only with technical practice, such as maybe practicing scales or arpeggios, depending on the pieces I'm learning, but I also like to warm up with etudes or some of my older pieces, just to get my fingers warm and really get my mindset to be geared towards what I'm about to be practicing in terms of my repertoire. And so I like to follow up my warm-up with some technical practice within my pieces. And so for me, this is the part that I usually struggle with the most in terms of my motivation, as it can be very tedious to practice like the same parts over and over in terms of trouble spots within my pieces. And so that's why I like to tackle that right away, right after my warm-up. And so for that, I would spend the most time, and usually I go into specific measures. I go into practicing specific runs or technique from within my pieces. And then I like to end off my practice sessions by doing a run through of the piece I've just practiced or of the pieces in my repertoire in general. And so this is a really great way for me to end off because it helps me gauge my progress each day. And so I can see how it feels to play that same piece each day and see if the parts are getting better or not. And also it helps because it really reminds me of why I'm here to practice and how I really want to see progress in these pieces. And so each day playing those pieces at the very end really helps me to, I guess, reaffirm why I love playing piano so much and helps to kind of round off that practice session with something I enjoy the most.
So similar to what Asma just said, usually when I start practicing, I start with technique for the first like 20 or 30 minutes just to warm up my fingers and my mind for my repertoire. And like maybe you'll notice like your hands a little stiff somewhere and you can focus on that for a few minutes just to get ready. And so it really depends on like what I'm preparing for at the moment. Lately, I haven't had too many new competitions or solo pieces. So some days I might spend even longer just because I've been focusing on like refining my left hand dexterity and balance. So afterwards, I'll start on my pieces where I start with more technically difficult passages, and then I'll move on towards musicality, which takes the most time. Yeah, and so I'll focus on like a certain measure or a certain phrase and go through my piece. I wouldn't say to take the amount of time too seriously because it honestly just depends on your personal goals, like what you're working on at the moment or how much repertoire you have. And if I have multiple pieces, like for CM testing, sometimes you'll have 4 or 5 pieces to work on. I find it helpful to just choose like 2 to focus on for that day so that you can really get a deep dive for those 2 pieces rather than just brushing over all 5 in a practice session.
I think it's fair for me to say that there were sort of 2 types of practice when we're talking about breaking down my sort of patterns when it comes to practicing. So one was pre-COVID practicing and one is post-COVID practicing. So definitely pre-COVID practicing, I had a lot less practice time and a lot of it came down to time management. So I feel like the discipline that I've built up during these quarantines, they weren't necessarily there. Between my lesson, which was on Tuesdays, and my Juilliard pre-college days, which were on Saturdays, mainly what I decided to practice that particular day was what my intuition told me what needed the most work at that particular time. So for example, if I had a certain amount of pieces to prepare for my lesson on Tuesday, I would want to focus on those as much as possible. And then I would have to prepare for playing in studio class on Saturday. So it was more a challenge of balancing this. Now that we're in quarantine and I have a lot more time to practice, I think that I've started building the habit that I start off every day with scales. And then I cycle through a few different books of technique like Pishna, Brahms' 51 Exercises, Isidore Philippe's technique book. And then I usually end off my warm-ups with a sight reading session. So I like to sight read every day because one, it keeps on helping my fingers decompress, and two, it's a very useful skill to have, especially when you come to, well, if I have to be at any time like an accompanist, I cannot pronounce that word. Anyway, yeah. So then after that warm-up period, hopefully it takes about 40 minutes, I focus on etudes, and right now I'm focusing on basically learning and performing all 24 of the main Chopin etudes, so the Opus 10 and 25 etudes. So I usually spend about 3 hours on etudes, and then I spend another 2.5 hours on regular rep. So that's my situation.
Great. All right. So to start off, I will be discussing mainly how I practiced during high school before quarantine. A lot of the time I've had to maintain large amounts of repertoire, which means 45 minutes to an hour or even more at a time. And at the same time, I had limited time to practice. And we all know that when you don't touch a piece for 1 or 2 days, it deteriorates. Even if just a little bit, the piece feels slightly more unfamiliar and raw to your fingers. So the challenge for me was to get ample warm-up and technique practice time while still tending to large amounts of repertoire. Thus, I worked on scales for 10 minutes maximum a day, not a lot. I don't practice scales to improve upon them per se, but instead to just warm up with them. If I'm going to do anything to improve upon my technique, I will through Chopin etudes because those hit multiple birds with one stone. First, they further my warm-up routine. People say Chopin etudes aren't the best pieces to warm up with, but for me, they acted as warm-up due to time constraints. And number two, they built my technique for the long run. For example, Opus 25, number 6, thirds, and Opus 10, number 2, chromatic, both practice finger independence and strengthen the weaker right-hand fingers. And right now I'm working on Opus 10, number 4, which really drills the left hand and overall finger agility. And number 3, etudes are part of my repertoire as well. Many competitions out there, whether local or international, require an etude in the program, so I really needed those to be top-notch. So yeah, I do Chopin etudes for 30 to 45 minutes, maybe an hour if I'm getting close to a competition or audition. I rarely brought etudes to lessons unless they were fairly new, so lessons did not dictate my etude practicing schedule. And then I dedicate the rest of the time, which is around almost or more than 2 hours, to repertoire. It isn't really possible for me to touch upon all of my repertoire every day if I want to really hone in and polish them all. So each day is dedicated to just 1 to 3 movements or pieces. However, in the 2 to 3 weeks before an event like a competition, audition, or performance, I decide to broaden my practicing and do run-throughs as much as I can. I cannot stress how helpful run-throughs are because when I do them, I'm most in the zone emotionally and nerves-wise. And in the 2 or 3 weeks before a competition, I try to run through each piece at least every other day.
Okay, so that's like really good advice by all 4 of our panelists. And now maybe also a very open-ended question, but we're gonna have like about 2 panelists answer questions from now on. The second question is, how should I divide up my pieces and practice sections? And first we're gonna hear from Lucas and then Asma.
Okay, so I think I'm gonna answer a very open-ended question with a very open-ended answer. I'm gonna say it depends because it really does. I feel like at least right now, when I'm practicing longer sessions at a time, I try to like the amount of time I allot to each piece that I focus on at one time, I usually have a minimum amount of time for that particular piece. So usually I like to spend, and like I commit at least 30 minutes to any particular, let's say, etude, or let's say just any specific movement of a larger piece. So I think that's also, it's very important because it can be very easy to gloss over certain larger fundamental structural problems within your piece if you feel like you've gotten into a next level and just sort of leave it for tomorrow. But if by allocating this amount of time to a specific piece, it forces me to sort of re-examine a bunch of underlying problems that could have sprung up over time. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Lucas when he says that it depends. But in general, I would say that most of the times, usually what I go for is depth rather than breadth, meaning that really honing in on certain aspects of a piece can be better than just running through your entire repertoire in the same day, because it doesn't really give you the time to delve into any underlying problems or even like discover those problems in the first place. And so usually in any given practice session, I will only focus on 1 to 2 pieces just to make sure that I can really spend time and mental focus on just getting the technical parts of that piece down. Sometimes what I'll do within a practice session is record myself playing that piece and then listening to it back so I can see if I really did improve on the section I wanted to, or just so I can kind of like gauge progress over the days. But at the same time, I do feel like it's important not to let any one piece rest for too long. So like if you're doing 1 or 2 pieces per day, definitely make sure that you're not letting it sit for too long so it doesn't go to waste in terms of the work that you've put in. But really balancing those 2 aspects, I think, is what makes a good practice schedule. But it definitely depends for each individual. So just finding something that works for you and your musical career.
Yeah, these are really good answers. Okay, so our next question is, how often should you take breaks when practicing? And this is going to be maybe an easier answer. So we're going to start with Asma, and then we're gonna hear from Catherine.
Right, so generally taking breaks from practicing is, again, it depends, but usually you should take a break if you feel frustrated. So I find that you can't really effectively practice if you feel frustrated with what you're doing. So if you're making a lot of mistakes, you notice that your mind is like not really into what you're doing, then step aside for a while, 10 or 20 minutes of just doing something else, maybe just sitting for a while, going for a quick walk, really helps to clear your mind. So when you come back to a session, you have that renewed focus that is really necessary. I would also say to take a break if you start to feel maybe hand or back pain, just to avoid injury. You really want to make sure that although you're practicing to the best of your ability, you want to prevent yourself from not being able to practice the next day. So know your limits as well and try not to injure yourself. I guess that's a given. And at the same time, I guess my third point would be to take a break if you find that you feel like you're going backwards in your practicing. And so what I mean by this is sometimes if you're doing continuous repetition of like a certain part of a piece, you may feel that like you're playing it so many times that you're starting to lose focus of what you really wanted to achieve with that segment. And so this kind of relates to the first thing I talked about, which is if you feel frustrated, take a break. And I would say that whenever you feel like you've been sitting for a really long time on a certain aspect, it can be better to sit down for a while and then come back. And not only does this help with mental focus, but it also helps with that renewed energy and maybe finding a different approach when you come back.
Yes, so Asma gave a great answer. I will just be adding on to that. So how often should we take breaks when we practice? The short answer is as often as we need to. It should depend on how we're feeling on a particular day and our energy and stress levels. So the long answer is that you really have to know yourself well, especially during junior and senior year of high school. You might feel like there is no such thing as a perfectly good day when you're perfectly awake and motivated and stress-free. So you have to gauge if and when you have a relatively good or not so good day. The key word here is relatively. And when you do have one of those better days, you really have to take advantage of that and seize those bursts of motivation. For me personally, after I have a rough practice session on a particular afternoon, and then I feel really stressed after that, I spend the evening reflecting on how I could have done better. And the day after, I tend to have a much better practice session because of that burst of motivation. And a random loose tip on the side is that if you're feeling particularly sleepy during a practice session, a power nap in the middle really helps. Studies show that we tend to get sleepy between 1 and 4 p.m. And so if you do practice during that time, just be aware of that and just rest whenever you need to.
Yeah, agreed with both panelists. Okay, so now we're going to move on to balance in practice. So these are kind of vague questions, but so there might be a lot of different answers. But the first one will be, how can I plan out my busy schedule to practice every day? This probably particularly applies to upperclassmen in high school. And we'll hear from Hannah, and then Lucas, and then Catherine.
So I'm gonna answer this from a more like general perspective of just your overall schedule and practicing piano. I definitely just struggle with this in high school because like many of us here, I spent a lot of, like, just as much energy and time on science and academics. But I think eventually what helped me most was just putting it as like a fixed part of my day. So how I like to think of it, it's like brushing your teeth right after you wake up. Like for most of, I'm pretty sure for most of us, it's a very fixed routine. You're not going to wonder if you have time to brush your teeth today or if you're going to brush your teeth today, because it's just something that you're going to do every day. And so for me, I just practiced piano first thing right after I got home from school every day, and it just became a very fixed, rigid part of my schedule that was a lot easier to follow. And definitely, like, sometimes I would practice for a long time and I'd only be able to start my homework like very late at night, but that's just how I decided to prioritize my own schedule. And it was one of the best ways personally to keep myself practicing consistently every day.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, I totally agree with everything that Hannah said. Making something fixed is very, very important. For me, once you have that sort of fixing, the fact that you have a limited amount of time, especially as an upperclassman in school, means that you really have to figure out what you're going to do with every single minute of that time. So I feel like an important thing is to have priorities when it comes to which pieces you're carrying. So make sure you know the difference between which pieces desperately need work as opposed to which pieces need work, which pieces you could wait for another day or two to work on. And I like to secure this by planning out a schedule beforehand. So what I used to do was I would ride the subway to school, and while it was like a 40-minute ride, and when I was on the train, I would plan out a schedule on like the Notes app on my phone, and I would allocate a certain amount of time to a certain amount of pieces. I would sort of anticipate what I would have to cover in the afternoon when I got home from school and had to practice. So that was how I was able to sort of plan out and make the most use of my upperclassmen years.
All right, so both of you guys gave great answers. Again, I'll just add on to that. And I will answer this question in greater detail and personal anecdotes when we get to the question about balancing academics and music. But for now, I'll be brief here with some tips. My first tip is to try to practice at the same time every day, if that's possible, and choose a time when you're not too physically or mentally tired, because your body will get used to that routine. Number two, mentally, you must learn how to compartmentalize. That's a key word. So while you're practicing, try your best to not worry about school-related things or tests or your other commitments, because that is counterproductive. It's really hard to mentally compartmentalize like that, but you have to try. And my third tip is the same thing as Lucas said, to use every minute on something productive. And by productive, I don't mean necessarily you use every single minute doing homework or practicing, but what I mean is every single minute you know what it is you're doing, whether that's relaxing, you know you're relaxing, whether that's like texting a friend, you know that you're texting a friend, you know that you're spending time on that, or it's like you're taking a nap. At least you have to recognize what you're spending your time on, and that'll help you a lot. Yeah.
Okay, and to follow up with that, we have another question which is kind of vague, so expect maybe different answers or like shorter answers because of lack of time, but what should my weekly schedule be like? And we're going to hear from Lucas and then Hannah.
Okay, so I think an important sort of distinction I made at some point during my high school career, I don't know why I say high school career, it wasn't really a career, but just high school time, was to stop really thinking about practicing one day at a time and start thinking about taking it 1 week at a time. I feel like I also started doing this with academic schoolwork, was to really see how, like, which days I had tests over the next week, which days I could anticipate having an excess or like a surplus of time or not having any extra time to practice. And basically I would make up for those by practicing extra on some days. And so instead of thinking that, oh, I'm going to practice X amount of hours every day, I start thinking about, oh, I'm going to try to practice X amount of hours every week, and I'm going to try to work around certain commitments to make that sort of fit, because it's so much easier if you think about it more big picture, I think.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with what Lucas said and what Catherine mentioned earlier, like being really intentional with how you spend your time during the week. So that's a pretty general question, but going back to what I mentioned earlier about having a set routine, I think in a week it's good to have certain goals or certain tasks that you accomplish like for each day at a fixed time. And then in terms of practicing pieces, all the panelists mentioned this earlier, but it's definitely, you want to focus on quality over quantity. And so maybe on one day you focus on 1 or 2 pieces, and then the next day you'll like go on a deep dive into your other 2 pieces. And then of course, I think it's a really good idea to run through all of your pieces, kind of like a mock performance or a mock competition, like once or twice a week. And moreover, going off of what Lucas said, if you're trying to manage your schedule on like a weekly basis, it's good to have that overall big picture. And so sometimes I'll keep like a little sticky note or a notebook, just a little planner of some sort where you keep like a list of 3 to 5 main goals that you want to accomplish that week. It'll help set your intentions, make them very clear for yourself, and you'll be able to like streamline your focus to those 3 goals a little more.
Okay, and great answers, everyone. So we did cover a lot about balancing academics and music, so we'll just be answering the first part of the next question, which is how many hours in general do you practice playing piano each day? So we're going to hear from all 4 panelists. First, Catherine, then Esma, and then Hannah, and then Lucas.
All right, so my answer for this question will actually be a continuation of my answer to the previous question. And in this one, I'll be giving greater detail and personal anecdotes. So my first tip was to try to practice at the same time every day. Personally, I practiced in the afternoons right after I got home from school, maybe after a snack break and or a 15-minute power nap, or just downtime first. But I do most practicing between like 3:30 to 4 p.m. all the way to dinner. I learned early on in high school that I cannot start with doing homework or studying, or else sometimes I might never get to piano. And pushing homework till later at night urges me to finish it faster and less distractedly as well. If I do finish homework and studying relatively early, such as around 10 p.m., and I still had some energy, I would practice a bit more, like until midnight. Sometimes I lose track of time and go beyond midnight, sometimes to 1 a.m. That's because practicing is such a compelling process. And again, you should not focus on how many hours you practice, but rather the tangible progress you made. And that was how and why I was losing track of time. But yeah, try your best to also set a timer for yourself. If it's too late at night, you have to get your sleep. And my second tip was to learn to compartmentalize mentally. And personally, it was difficult for me to not stress about non-piano related responsibilities when I practiced. It's so easy for our minds to wander. And I personally still have work to do on this. But what I realized is stressing about a test you worry you didn't do well on, or an upcoming test while you practice, is not doing you any good. Since your task at hand is to practice, it's actually counterproductive to practice while you're distracted. So when that does happen to you, go outside, take a walk, eat a snack, take a nap, or maybe do something else to alleviate your stress, and then go back and practice with a clearer mind. Trust me, it'll really help you in the long run. I will also add another tip, and that is to give yourself leeway in your schedule. If you plan to practice like 2.5 hours in a particular day, but it isn't going so well for you, you can give yourself an extra half hour, even if it bleeds a little into your homework time. Your progress, again, should not depend on how many hours you practice, but what you tangibly accomplish and how your music improves in each practice session. And we'll be talking later on how you can sense what you need to improve on. And a practice journal helps a lot with this, as Hannah mentioned.
Right, so I think the other 3 panelists already made some really good points, so my answer will be quite brief, but I also think it's important that it isn't necessarily about the number of hours, but more so accomplishing your practice goals. And so it's really important to be setting those goals. And like the other panelists said, sometimes it's better to do this on a long-term basis rather than just day by day, just so that you can accommodate for other things that you have going on. So for me, during the school year, I found it really hard to chunk really large amounts of practice time during the week, especially given the rigor of the academic program that I was in. And so I'd usually make up for this on the weekend where I had time to chunk in larger practice sessions. And so it isn't really about like a set number of hours per day. Some days on certain weekdays, I would only have time to practice like between 30 minutes and an hour, but it's about making the most of the practice time that you do have, just committing yourself to using every minute productively and thinking of your goals in the long term, and just doing those self-assessments at the end of every week or at the end of every 2 weeks or even monthly, just to see how far you've come and how you can adapt your practice style accordingly to accommodate the time that you have.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Asma and Catherine. Those are very valuable tips to have. And it's always really hard to answer this question because it always does come down to your personal goals, your personal repertoire, and it's really difficult to just compare how long you're practicing with another pianist who might be working on completely different repertoire than you. And so just personal anecdotes, I would practice at least 2 to 3 hours on school days right after school, just because I had homework afterwards. But if I was preparing for a competition, I would make up for lost time on weekends and during the summer, where I would practice just as much as I felt like I needed to, as much as possible, without injuring myself or disturbing the neighbors. And ultimately, practicing became focused on how much you're accomplishing in each session or how much you're accomplishing over the week rather than the amount of time. And so, yeah, like I said, making the piano routine is really important, and the self-control and the discipline that you'll get from that, it'll help you in academics. If some of you guys are wondering about balancing your academics, yeah, so focus less on all that you have to finish and more just on getting it done and how much you're improving that day or that week or every 2 weeks.
Okay, so I think first I'm gonna just give down a basic breakdown of what my practice schedule was like during when we had school, and then I'll move on to two more tips. Hopefully I can remember them off the top of my head, but here we go. So I can't practice after 8:30 because then the neighbors yell at me. So we sort of set that time, but also the earliest I can get home from school is 4:30. So what I usually do is I get home from school, I like what Kat said about decompression using 15-minute power naps. I use those a lot, especially between 2 really big practice chunks. But what I would do is I'll take a 15-minute power nap, and then I would practice from then until dinner. I would allocate probably half an hour to have dinner, and then I would go back to practicing, and I would finish practicing at 8:30. I would probably decompress for another 15 minutes, and then I would get started on homework, and I would work ideally up until right before midnight, and then I would go to bed, wake up at 6:30. Yeah. So that was sort of the schedule that I went through, especially over these last 2 years when I really reinforced that and really drove myself to follow this. But I think what's really important is it can be really overwhelming to think that one has to sort of follow this schedule. And I think that if you sort of have yourself immediately get on this sort of grind, it can immediately overwhelm you, and this drive can be put out really easily. So I do think that you have to focus on sort of coaxing yourself into this mindset first. And then once you have this mindset, it's a lot about mental health and making sure that you do in fact have enough sleep. And you can, but really balancing practicing and academics, it's like a workout for the mind. It's mentally conditioning yourself to sort of being able to simultaneously bear this amount of stress and also to continue to inspire yourself to keep on practicing. And you have to draw this inspiration from anywhere around you every day. And my second and final tip is, I love how people have been saying quality over quantity. I really respect that, but that does not mean that quantity does not matter either. And I do think that you have to have a certain amount of time put in if you really want to stay in the game. I'm not, obviously this time varies for a lot of people because everyone's work habits do differ, but you need to be able to gauge your progress. And I think that's very important. And I think that comes with quantity as well as quality.
Yeah, so we just heard 4 very insightful answers, and I like how everyone expressed that everyone is different, so everything comes in moderation, like quantity, quality, and comparing practice times and that kind of stuff. So next up we have Asma answering, how do you deal with frustration in practicing, and how do you keep up energy for effective practice?
Right, this is a really great question that I think we've sort of touched on in some of our previous answers. And I think one of the key things to think about is taking breaks. And I like how Catherine was talking about taking breaks as often as you need to, because on different days you can be in different moods. One day you may feel really excited about practicing and spend a couple of hours really nailing down the hard parts. And there might be days where you really don't feel like practicing at all, or you just find it hard to continue to sit at the piano to really work through difficulties. And so I think in addition to breaks, whether it be power napping, taking a walk, eating a snack just to get yourself some nutrition, some energy, I think it's also really important to remind yourself why you're practicing, or remind yourself of the end goal that you're working towards. So this ties into what we were talking about earlier in terms of setting goals for yourself. And so really just trying to visualize the end result can help you put in the effort day to day. So whether this be going on YouTube, listening to maybe some different renditions of the piece you're working on, or maybe talking to your teacher about like how you can maybe practice more effectively, or maybe some different methods for practicing, really trying to maybe add some different techniques to your practice sessions can help you find a renewed motivation. And I think with keeping up energy, it's definitely something that takes time, as every person has a different way of practicing and everyone gets motivated by different things. And so for me personally, taking breaks is very effective. For some people, it may take more of a process for them to figure out how to really sit at the piano for a long time. But the key takeaway from my answer is that mindset is really important. And you really need to try to hold yourself accountable for putting in the effort if you want to see progress. And if not, you may need to enlist the help of those around you to hold you accountable, whether it be siblings, whether it be parents, if you can't find that motivation yourself for a while. But I think that it really needs to come from within for it to be the most effective. And so really try to look at what motivates you to play piano every day and why you enjoy it so much, and your answer will lie there.
I absolutely love that answer. And in fact, I'm in a lot of accountability group chats and stuff, just because for many different things. Okay, our final question for practicing and balancing your practice is, how do you overcome practicing under pressure? So maybe timely pressure or competition pressure, whatever pressure. And we're going to be hearing from Catherine and Hannah, who both have a lot of experience with practicing under pressure.
Yeah, all right. So I'm not sure exactly what practicing under pressure means to whoever asked the question, but I'll assume you mean practicing the days leading up to an important competition or performance. My biggest tip is to use the pressure to your advantage. It is so hard to simulate adrenaline or nervousness during practicing before you actually get those nervous feelings on stage. So for you to even be able to feel nervous when you practice is actually a powerful tool. You should manifest that tool to help you get in the zone even when you practice. This is why running through your pieces the days before the big event really helps, because run-throughs by themselves give you a greater adrenaline kick than when you sit back and polish bits and pieces of your repertoire. That, combined with the pressure you're getting from your upcoming competition or performance itself, is enough nervousness for you to actually undergo mock performances. And these will really give you more confidence and less stage fright during the real deal performance. Experience shows. So bottom line is to recognize the pressure as a good thing and use it to your advantage. But of course it gets overwhelming, and when that happens, then patience and positive attitude are key. If like 2 days before your competition, you have a memory slip, or all of a sudden you can't play a technically difficult passage anymore and you don't know why, don't worry. Rather, be grateful that the mishap happened to you at home rather than on stage, and just do your best to remedy it calmly and the way you normally practice.
Yeah, and I definitely did struggle with this a lot, like in preparing for big competitions, especially when I had a lot of school academic projects going on at the same time. And like, I'll be honest, I did have like several mental breakdowns before competitions where I was just like in tears or just nonstop panic because it felt like so much to handle. And ultimately, I think after going through all of that, I decided that for myself, it's definitely okay to set high expectations, even if they might seem unrealistic. And to not shy away from that pressure, like Catherine said, like definitely recognize that it's there, but use it to your advantage, because working hard is one of the few things that you can control when it comes to like competitions and performances. And if you really own that one thing that you can control, which is working hard and practicing, then I think, you can let yourself be proud of the fact that you gave all that you had. And other factors you can't really do much about those other factors that might be out of your control. And so for me, if I knew that I had given this event all that I had, you'll definitely grow and improve in some way, regardless of the results. And it's the process that honestly is so valuable. And a lot of times it's very difficult, right? Your teacher might push you really hard, you'll feel a lot of pressure, but it's an ongoing process, right? And being able to feel that energy into motivation and even more drive and passion, that's what makes pianists and musicians really incredible and inspiring for each other. So.
Yeah, I like that part, especially like to set ambitious goals, but don't like beat yourself up if you don't like achieve them, because they are ambitious goals after all, and hard work is really important. But at the end of the day, as long as you're like, it will fuel your growth, and that's the most important thing. So really good answer. And then now we're going to move on to practicing repertoire. So we're going to hear from Asma and then Lucas. This question is, do you have any specific personal practice techniques when you're working on repertoire?
Right. So for me personally, something that works really well, as I'm sure it works well for other people as well, is repetition. And so the first step to that is really honing in on the particular measures that are causing you problems. And so I think when it comes to diagnosing where in your piece the problem lies, I mentioned this before, but recording yourself is a really good method. Sometimes while you're playing, it can be hard to hear where exactly the problem lies. But if you record yourself and then listen to it later, you might be able to easily see what the issue is, whether it be tempo, articulation. I know dynamics are kind of hard to hear if your mic quality isn't that good, such as is with my phone, but it can really help as a first step. And I think when it comes to specific techniques, it really depends on the piece. For example, if you find a piece has a lot of arpeggios, you might want to just practice the raw arpeggios just to get your fingers used to that dexterity, and also practicing etudes that might help with that skill. For example, Chopin etudes, as Catherine and Lucas kind of discussed before. Another method that I like to use is listening to the pieces on YouTube. So this can really help with musicality, finding my own interpretation, and just playing around with, for example, like the rubato and with the phrasing, just to see how I can put my own unique spin on a piece and how to really get it to the level that I want. And last but not least, something I like to do with dynamics is I tend to, when I practice, I like to exaggerate my dynamics and then pull it back later. And so the reason for this is that it helps me hear them in the first place and sort of get them up to par. And it's much easier, I think, to pull them back later than to try to add them when you didn't have any in the first place. And so that's something that works well for me. It really depends on the piece, again, but those are just a few methods that I use.
I fully agree with all. It's good. I fully agree with all of the techniques that you suggested, Asma. I think, yeah, also it very much depends on the piece. So I'm just going to list a few of the techniques for, well, like the few of my sort of methods for specific aspects of technique that you might have to tackle in any piece you have to play. So definitely, I think one of the most important ones is having a refined sound. And obviously this type of sound is going to vary from piece to piece, and it's up to you to really recognize what sound you want. So definitely when I'm first tackling a piece and I really want to concentrate on sound, it's not even slow practice. It's just taking individual notes and figuring out like the physiology and the angle of and the attack of your hand in relation to the piano to help achieve that sound. And in order to make that sound normalized, you just have to keep on trying to play, like, how about just like one phrase with that particular sound, not a single note out of place. And this can also help with phrasing as well. I like, when I first learn a piece, I really like to also do a technique that I call skeletonization. And that usually involves taking a melody and perhaps like the bones of another voice, sort of out of context, and just sort of focusing on that, and basically concentrating on different combinations of these different voices. And this works especially well in Bach fugues. When I was young, I learned that it was very important to, if I had a 4-voice Bach fugue, I would take any combination of 2 voices and I would be practicing those together. So maybe I would play it through. and I would just try to go through all of the combinations, and that would lead it sounding less chordal and more polyphonic, more like there are different sort of threads being intertwined as you're playing. And lastly, just as small other method for evenness, I like to swing the rhythms. So if there's a steady sort of 16th note or 8th note rhythm going along, I do da 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 da, and then also the opposite way, which would be da 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 with this particular run, and that would help achieve probably the most control on the evenness of this phrase. So yeah.
Yeah, for me, definitely Bach fugues and voices separately are a pain in the neck, but they're very helpful in the long run. And sorry about that. Sorry for the interruption. I was actually looking at the next slide or the next question, which is, what do you generally try to achieve in each practice session? So maybe like goals and that type of stuff. And we're going to hear from Lucas and then Esma.
So again, it really depends on the piece. But definitely, I think something that's kept constant, irregardless of piece, is the fact that you are trying to achieve something at the end of the day, and the way that you achieve this is through constant concentration, and this means that you really have to discipline your focus. You need to be able to notice when your mind is going off track. You need to be able to notice what is triggering your mind to focus on other things, and by sort of monitoring this will allow your work to become more and more productive over time, so it won't really matter as much what sort of repertoire you're playing. Also, I think something that's really important for gauging progress is that if you focus, let's say you draw like a slow passage at the beginning of the day, and you've gotten to a point where it flows really nicely, but I feel like something that can really put the cherry on top and make sure that that sticks is by coming back to that same passage at the end of the day and making sure that that sort of progress is still there. And if it takes several days to achieve this, then fine. You just need to really keep at it. And that goes back to what Asma was saying about repetition. It's all very important that way.
For sure. I think that setting goals are really important, as Lucas talked about and as I think all of our panelists touched on today. In terms of what I try to achieve at each practice session, this could be something like learning up until a certain measure if it's a new piece. It could be maybe memorizing a certain section, or it could just be goals in terms of tempo, voicing, or fluidity. I think it's really important to specifically identify what it is that you want to work on. For example, a while back, I was learning some of Schubert's impromptus, and so the goals that I set for myself were in terms of phrasing, fluidity, really focusing on the musicality of it, as opposed to anything else. And so during those particular practice sessions, I would really tell myself to focus on those specific things, and then checking back at the end to make sure those were done would be the key thing that I would do. So really just setting a goal in terms of a particular aspect that you want to work on, in terms of any of those factors that you find within your pieces, is really important.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next question, and we actually have a lot of questions left, but we only have about 5 minutes left. So I think maybe I can, all right, so we're actually, for now, we're going to keep, the panelists are going to keep their answers to around like 30 seconds from now on, and then I might add in a poll to just see where you are and what the attendees would prefer. But our next question is, what are ways to keep your motivation on a piece that you've been practicing hard for many months and still keep it fresh and original? So we're going to hear from Hannah and Catherine.
Yeah, so good ways to keep it fresh and original. I like to go on YouTube and just listen to different interpretations. Try to remember why you chose this piece in the beginning. Maybe you didn't choose it, but that's okay. You can take a step back, enjoy the piece just as good music, and just, you know, challenge yourself, experiment with different ways to practice. Lucas brought up many good points in that. And just, yeah, examine the piece from different angles, appreciate it as just a really masterful piece of music. And yeah, it's good to stay motivated, and you'll continue to improve based on that.
Yeah, that's great. So it is difficult to stay motivated and enthusiastic when you bring the same piece to multiple competitions and performances, but this is when mindset comes to be super important. I'll go into this in more detail later, but I approach competitions from a growth mindset perspective always, and treat them more as performances rather than competitions. I remind myself that I'm there to show something unique and personal to whoever hears me in a competition, whether that's 5 jury members or a fuller audience, it does not matter. They don't know and don't care if I'm a bit burnt out by a piece. They're hearing it for the first time, so you have to bring as much spontaneity as you can to each performance. One tip / pep talk I give myself before I perform is to surprise myself on stage. I literally tell myself, surprise me, show me what you can express. And that is exactly what keeps each performance of a piece fresh, no matter how old it is. You must adopt the expectation to surprise yourself in each performance, and even in each day you practice. You have to recognize that music is a continuous journey and that there is always room to do more, express more, and learn more about a piece, no matter for how long you have been playing it. One other tip to avoid burnout is to set aside the piece for periods of time, especially when you don't need to perform it for a few months. More often than not, when you come back to the piece, you do so with fresh new perspectives, even if all you've done was set it away for a period of time.
Yeah, so I really liked especially what Catherine said about like even surprising yourself on stage, because like just letting things go and seeing things come into play is really nice. Okay, so we have like a few, okay, I feel like, all right, so there's gonna be 3 more questions, except we're gonna have our panelists answer like in really short time increments, and then we're gonna skip over the other questions. And for people who ask like specific questions for our panelists, feel free to email them separately or follow up. But I really wanted to know if you guys preferred more of us just answering questions you submitted, or asking questions live. So feel free to comment that in the group chat to everyone, because I'm trying to like enter a poll, but my Wi-Fi is kind of down. So okay, sorry. Our next question is, how do you deal with memory slips, and do you need to just practice more, or are you relying too much on muscle memory? And also, does mental practicing help? So we're going to hear from Catherine, Asma, and Hannah, and also a reminder to our panelists, keep your responses really short.
Okay, I'll try my best. So honestly, I use muscle memory a lot, and it's really not very secure once you're on stage. The first tip I have is, I've mentioned this earlier, to do run-throughs more. What a surprise, I know. If you want to simulate adrenaline, then record your run-throughs. Trust me, it'll make you more nervous. And after enough run-throughs, you'll find the spots where you have the greatest tendency to memory slip, so make sure you know the notes to the T in those places. The second tip I have, I guess, which is pretty obvious, is to practice the left hand alone. Sometimes that might be hard to do, so if you want to make it easier, you can play the right hand on your knee or something to just simulate the motion. The point is to hear what your left hand is doing, since hearing can often help us remember. And here's another tip that in practice is probably not very, very helpful, but here goes. Often we memory slip on stage because we overthink. Our brains are playing too much of a role. Like, for example, when we're at the 2-minute mark of a piece, our brains remind us that, oh no, we didn't memorize the left hand note by note at the 3-minute mark of the piece. And then once we get to that 3-minute mark, we freak out, hope desperately that muscle memory can save us, and then, oh no, we memory slip. So what I found works for me to handle that is that the more emotionally invested I am into my music, and the more I focus on bringing out character rather than playing the right notes, the less likely I am to memory slip. The thing is, like, if you're worried about memory slipping, you will memory slip. If you're worried about memory slipping, then you're not performing and expressing the present. So all in all, just focus on the part of the music that's right in front of you in that period of time, and just giving that your absolute all. The less you think about memory slipping, the more you'll enjoy yourself as well, and the less likely you are to really.
Definitely. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Hannah. Catherine mentioned some really great points in terms of practice, but I think that listening to a piece as well outside of practice time helps a lot, because it can really help your mind anticipate what's coming next in terms of the melody or in terms of what your hands should be playing. And so I think that would count partially as mental practice. I really like to run through a piece in my head sometimes if I'm not physically at the piano. So if I'm commuting to and from school or somewhere else, I think that that can help me sometimes, rather than just relying on muscle memory. So I guess in short, just making sure that you know the piece really well.
Yeah, for sure. And what my teacher would do is divide the piece into certain sections. So maybe you'll have a new section every 3 phrases or 12 bars or something. And then she'd just test me by saying like, play section 1, and then 10 seconds later, switch to section 2, 3, and so on. She'd have me go backwards for a challenge or like skip around just so you are really familiar with the overall structure. And then yes, mental practicing is definitely very helpful. If you can hear the piece in your head away from the piano and play it on like the table or something, hearing it in your head is definitely beneficial for solidifying your memory, and not just the motions, the physical motions, but actually hearing it and the musicality.
Okay, so our second to last question is, how has your practice evolved as you learn new types of pieces? And we're going to hear really briefly from Lucas and then Hannah.
Okay, so I think honestly, just like practice has evolved in terms of discipline, and also by sort of sticking to the methods that I've mentioned earlier. But I think also another tip that's really important is to figure out what you value most about your particular interpretation of a piece, whether it's expressivity, fluidity, constancy, virtuosity, any of the following. And I think that by doing that, by focusing on that primarily in your practice, it'll make your interpretations more colorful, it'll make them more fun to practice, and it will ensure that you're going to be more true to yourself as a musician at the end of the day.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as I got into harder pieces, my practice became a lot less repetitive, and I started focusing more on literally just like a single phrase or a single chord, more close listening rather than just pure repetition, and experimenting with how you phrase a chord, or how you phrase a certain phrase, or how you balance a certain chord. And for really technically difficult pieces, it's not practical to repeat it until you injure yourself. So it was important for myself to find and experiment new ways to sound just as musical, but not physically burn out. Started, taking notes in a notebook so that I could reference that while I practiced, and then recording myself a lot. I really didn't like listening to myself play, but that is one of the fastest ways to improve.
Yeah, and then our last question is, what do you listen for when you practice? And if you find issues in your practice, how do you go about finding issues in practice? So we're going to hear from Asma and then Catherine.
Recording yourself is a really great way to find those mistakes, as I previously touched upon. Another really great way is playing right hand separately and left hand separately for a certain part, and this can really help you narrow down what the issue is, whether it be maybe your left hand and not knowing that well enough, or maybe your right hand has something technically challenging. It really helps to isolate those different parts so you can find it. This can also work for voicing. Maybe you have issues with a certain voice, and so I think playing those separately can help you narrow down what the issue is. In terms of what I listen for when I practice, I listen for the different factors, I guess, that a piece would entail. And so it depends on what my goals are that particular week. If I know that I've been working on musicality that week, I would definitely be listening more for that as I practice, as opposed to the other factors. But it's definitely important to listen for all aspects of a piece when you're playing, and also after you're playing, if you're listening to a recording of yourself.
All right, yeah, so when I practice, I listen for a lot of things such as rhythm, articulations, pacing, phrasing, clean pedaling, style, and a lot more. And I don't think I need to go more into these per se, since we all know to listen for these things. But more importantly, if you want to go above and beyond, you have to transcend just listening for things. Instead, you must sense and feel your playing as you practice. And to that end, the main elements I feel for are immersion and conviction. By immersion, I mean, are you fully expressing rather than emotionally glossing over each phrase and each section of your music? And is each and every character that you bring out authentic? So for these questions, you have to sense and feel them rather than just indifferently analyze them. And then also by conviction, I mean, do you have full conviction in your stylistic and interpretational choices? For example, like if you were to explain your interpretational choices to someone else, say your piano teacher, would you do so without doubt? So if you can answer these questions affirmatively, then you're on track to bringing your playing to another level.
All right, awesome. So we're going over time, except we have so many amazing questions sliding in, and we're gonna have an open Q&A session now, except I just really wanted to briefly cover is that we are skipping over 4 slightly unrelated questions to this webinar, so that's why we are skipping them. But they were, is playing piano helpful in a college application, and how important are piano competitions in college applications? So actually all 4 of our panelists today are either in college already or rising freshmen at Harvard, McGill University, UCLA, NEC, and Princeton. So they are all very experienced people, and at the end we'll send a follow-up email, and you can privately email them. Oh, Hannah is a rising sophomore, I think. But yeah, so you can all privately email them, and they can get back to you one-on-one if you're more interested in hearing about that. But we're also going to have future webinars that cover piano competitions and maybe college apps related to piano. I don't know. So yeah, stay tuned for that if you're interested. And for sight reading tips, we might cover that also in a future webinar. Same for music theory and why it's important. And practice tips for younger students, feel free to email us at H.O.P.E or any of the panelists. And then for specific questions for panelists, they were as follows, I don't even know if that makes sense. What do you need to prepare to apply for a music dual degree, double major, or minor? And our panelists have gone through that for applying to college, so you can email them as well. And also pursuing piano as a major, you can ask Lucas. And if you have questions about being like a certified Yamaha teacher or something, you can ask Asma. They're all in the presentation, by the way, which Alex will send to the whole group chat. And then practicing Chopin etudes, Catherine and Lucas have had a lot of experience on this. So now, during the webinar, we have collected 2 anonymous specific questions. And the first one is, did any of you try to quit piano at some point in your early years? And if so, what did you, your parents, or your teacher do to make you stay with piano and eventually love it? So did anyone here actually quit piano as a child? You can raise your hand. Okay, so
I didn't think about it. Like,
you thought about it? Okay.
No,
so
I didn't think about it. It just sort of like, I wasn't pushed as hard as some other kids as a child, and then I just sort of like found the drive by myself when I was older. So I just wasn't ever motivated enough or stressed enough to declare that this instrument is over for me. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So actually, funny story, I'm actually not a panelist, I'm just the host, but for me, I did quit piano for exactly 365 days. I quit in May 30th, 2015, and then resumed in May 31st, 2016. So during that time, I did not touch the piano at all. But ultimately, then I met another teacher that I kind of knew about through competitions, and she's really well known in my area, and she really helped me find a real love for music and really just learning more about music, like opening my eyes to things I've like never known about before. So I would really thank my teacher for that. So, and thank my parents for letting me try piano again. So yeah, okay. So our next question is, do you practice in a special way after a long vacation away from home? So as in like, if you haven't touched the piano in a really long time, how do you go about this? So does anyone want to speak about this?
Can you repeat the question?
So if you like don't practice piano for a really long time, or if you go on vacation for a month, how do you come about like practicing again?
Yeah, just very slow practice. Just really ease yourself back in, because you just want to be careful that you don't overexert your hands immediately after. That's really all I have to say.
Yeah, I remember like when I went to visit colleges and stuff, like I was away from home for a while. I remember just like listening to the pieces while I was gone, just so I could remember what it sounded like, reviewing my old lessons. And then when I came back, I always felt like my hands were a little stiff or like made of stone, that kind of feeling. So I would just warm up with a lot of technique and just slowly ease back into that musical mindset.
Yeah, so I was pretty fortunate that throughout high school I did not take super long vacations away from the piano. It was just a few days to a week maybe. But I remember one time in 8th grade, I had an outdoors trip to Yosemite for a week, and the day after I got back was a studio class in which I had to play the first movement of a concerto. So that was a stressful experience, and how I handled it was I actually tried to use the vacation and all of like the mental rejuvenation that I got from that as emotional fuel. So when I came back, I was more calm than ever, even though I had a recital or slash studio class the very next day. And the way I approached the piece, just like coming back to the piano bench after a week, was that I played it with the score, opened up the score and just calmly played it. I figured that would be less stressful than if I like decided to try to see if I had it memorized and mess up and just freak out after that. Just took it one step at a time and just spent some hours, and it really did eventually get into my fingers. The bottom line is to have faith that it won't be as bad as you like dread that it will be after you come back from a vacation, and like the other panelists mentioned, to just take things.
Yeah, okay, so same for me, I guess, since I didn't touch the piano for a year. For me, I lost all of my finger agility. Like, I think as a kid, I used to be all technique and that was it, but I really just couldn't move my fingers. So it just started with like slow practice, and I kind of built it up after maybe 2 months. It felt normal to me again. So, okay, so now we have an open Q&A session. So if anyone, I don't know if we have like raised hands options here, I'm not sure, but if you just want to go ahead and talk, feel free to do so. If you don't feel comfortable talking, then you can message me, I guess. Yeah, you can just unmute yourself and ask away.
I have a question.
Yes.
So like, say like you're performing, right? And like, maybe say like it's not going like as well as you like hoped it would be, you know? Like, how would you guys like deal with it, like, or make it like better, like during the performance, I guess?
Does anyone want to answer that?
It's always tough to stay mentally strong during a performance, but realize that just like how the audience is in the moment, you should be in the moment too. Don't let a mishap from like 1 minute or 2 minutes ago shape your playing for the present up until the future, up until the end of the piece. Try your best to try to hear the music for what it really is, rather than for the way that you're playing it, because that is what inspired you to perform, to learn the piece in the first place. And I know it's much harder done than said, but try your best to refresh yourself. Realize that the audience is in there with you in the present. They have probably forgotten about like your slip or whatever rough thing happened a minute ago, and just try to carry on. I know it's really difficult. We all have those rough performances, but the minute we mentally reset ourselves, that is when things go better. I truly believe.
Yeah, there are performances where I've like very obviously just stopped and had a huge memory slip in the middle of a competition. But as long as you just, like Catherine said, be in the present, focus on what you still can do with the rest of the piece, work your best on that. Whoever's listening, the judges, the audience, they will recognize that as long as you keep going and present all that you've worked on for the rest of the piece, you will be just fine.
Okay, I'll just, I really understand the idea of mental reset, and I think that is actually very important, especially taking like just really deep breaths in between movements. That can really just get you back on track. But as for during the performance, what really throws me off the most, it's when a problem arises with the piano, like a key starts to stick, or there starts to be some sort of like weird echo, or like the middle pedal doesn't work, something really weird like that. Because that's sort of beyond my control at that point, and that's like what really unseats me. But I think also having had experience with that has allowed me to view my own mistakes as a pianist with sort of like less alarm, and it has allowed me to sort of reset more easily, even if it's in the middle of a piece. And I also completely agree with what these two people said about just really getting your mind off what has happened. Obviously, like don't cry over spilled milk, and just think about the music at hand.
Yeah, for me, I think it's like what's done is already done. Just keep looking forward. It's just, I've experienced a lot of bad performances, but usually like when you're practicing, you like to think ahead and also look back, just to like reflect and stuff. But when you're performing, just always think ahead and just enjoy everything that you've played so far, and don't be like critical about it, because then I kind of lose my focus and then get more worried. So.
I think it's a process that happens. Sorry, Elizabeth. I was going to say, I think it's a process that happens from before your performance to during your performance and even afterwards, where beforehand you really want to make sure you're in the right mental space for getting ready to showcase all that you've worked for. And so I think, as the other panelists have mentioned, it's really important to allow yourself to mentally reset, even if you've made a mistake, and just really focus on doing the best you can with the rest of the performance. I have had my fair share of issues with the piano as well, and sometimes it really ends up being unfortunate. One time for an exam, the very first note of my toccata was a low E, and that one note just so happened to be the one problem note with that piano, like where the string was kind of off, and so I plunked that first note down, and the sound was so off. That was not the tone that I practiced at all. And I just had that unfortunate luck of it being like the one note on the piano that actually had an issue with it. And so even though that threw me off immensely, because that was the first piece in my program, it's really important to just calm down, take deep breaths and really let yourself be in the moment and really focus on what you're playing, as opposed to the audience, as opposed to, oh no, everyone's going to judge me. Everyone's going to think that I don't know how to play or that I haven't practiced. It's really just about enclosing yourself in a sort of personal focus bubble and letting yourself just showcase all that you've worked for and letting your musicality shine through from within, just staying focused.
Yeah, okay. Does anyone else have any other questions? And by the way, we're really sorry this is going over time. We always have these amazing questions. So if you need to go, feel free to go. But if you want to stay and listen, ask questions, then feel free to. What time should we end? We'll end at around 8:30 unless more people start to leave. So if you have any more questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
I have a question. To Lucas. Yeah. My question is, how long you practice scale every day, and normally what is the speed you use to practice scale?
Okay, so I actually do have a procedure for this. So I was scared for a sec there, but anyway, here we go. So I think that when I start practicing scales, I do it at 4 different metronome tempos. I like to practice 2 different scales. So I will pick a key, and then I will also do its relative minor. So for example, I will do C major and then A minor, and I will practice harmonic minor, melodic minor. I will go 4 octaves up and down the keyboard. I will do contrary motion. Then I'll do arpeggios. Then I'll do octaves, and then I'll do chromatic. And I do this at, I do 4 different metronome speeds specifically for the scales, contrary motion, and the arpeggios. So I'll start at 116, then I'll do 132, then I'll do 152, and then I'll do 176 beats per minute. So that's my process for scales, and usually that takes about 20 minutes.
Sorry, how long it is?
20 minutes.
20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We just had a question come in about what are our favorite pieces. Let's see.
Does someone want to go first?
I can't narrow it down to like 1 or 2 pieces. There are just too many out there. I guess since H.O.P.E is sort of a piano webinar, should we limit it to piano pieces? Okay. Someone else go first, because I can't think of them off the top of my head, and I don't want to be able. I don't want me to say something dumb, and future is going to be looked back at. Yeah.
Me neither. But wait, Chloe, is it pieces that you would want to learn in the near future, or just pieces in general? Because it depends. Yeah.
Just
And
like any pieces, I
any
guess.
pieces. Oh
Any
man, check
piece,
out the romantic sonatas. Liszt Sonata B minor.
Liz
Chopin's
Sonata, yes.
Rachmaninoff Second Sonata. There's too many to count. Just email me if you want some specific recommendations for listening.
The
Yeah.
greatest
Go ahead,
piano
Alex.
piece of all time. Yes, we have something planned for that. Keep an eye out.
Pictures at an exhibition is very epic. Thank you, Alex.
All right, does anyone else have any other questions?
I'm a really big fan of Scriabin Fantasy. It's like my #1 guilty pleasure.
I love Scriabin.
Yeah. And
I have one more question. So, is it really helpful or necessary to also practice melodic minor scale?
I think all scales in general are good to practice, especially because they have like different spacings for your fingers. Definitely like melodic minor scales are different from harmonic minors, just in the way they're structured. And yeah, does anyone else have anything to add?
All these different kinds of scales will show up in your pieces as you progress. So I think just being familiar, it won't hurt. It definitely won't hurt, and it will help you to be familiar with all different.
there was another. Oh yeah, sorry. There was another question down in the comments.
Yeah.
What do you think is the greatest benefit of practicing piano? Honestly, discipline, learning, time management, and learning focus, and that just translates into like the rest of your life is just so much easier from that. I mean, like I haven't lived without practicing piano, so I can't say for sure, but at least that's what I think.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of things like involving the brain is really helpful. It benefits a lot, and like in general, I think knowing how to play the piano is more of like a skill that's not seen as often in society, as in like if you know how to do math really well, you can show people that, and you can show people your logical thinking skills. And I think for playing piano, it's really good for like just for your brain, and it's just for applying it, like its applications to life also. It's made me a more creative person, I think. And yeah, and self-discipline, definitely.
Yeah, all those life skills piano can teach you, including what Lucas and Elizabeth said, self-discipline, resilience, determination, everything. But piano is also, it also makes your whole entire existence, not to be deep, much more meaningful. It just adds so much color to your life. It makes you much more emotionally aware of the world around you as well. You can just empathize with your those around you and your own experiences in a much more open way. And I really don't want to get deep and cheesy about this, but it just helps in every facet of your life.
And just like look at this wonderful community that we have from just piano. Like you can find some of the most amazing connections and communities just from doing piano or even music in general. It's very fulfilling.
Aside from all the transferable skills, the community is definitely a really great aspect of it. Just being able to bond with someone over a common love of piano or common love of music, and just talk about pieces you enjoy playing and enjoy listening to is really something that is a great experience and a great way to meet other people and get to know them better. And so I think that it really is a great pursuit and a great hobby in many different facets of life. And I can definitely say that I've used the skills I've learned from piano, such as the ones Lucas mentioned, like focus and time management, in other aspects of my life too. And so if you're debating whether or not to continue playing piano, I would say that you should try going for it if it's something that you enjoy doing, because it'll definitely be an asset to you in many different aspects later on.
Cheers to that.
Yeah, and also the emotional maturity that Catherine said, I think has really helped me. And also in general, this community is full of like the most like brilliant and hardworking people, like some of the most brilliant hardworking people I know. And also, just another plug, if you haven't joined H.O.P.E yet, join our community of pianists, especially if you play the piano. I'm sorry it's not open to other musicians, but that's what also makes us unique. And also, if you're interested, make sure to look at the final slide in our presentation where we have a bunch of links to all of our stuff, and also keep an eye out for an email from us, and we'll send that to you also. Does anyone else have any other questions? Maybe like one or two final questions before we end this webinar. Speak now or forever hold your silence. If you're not comfortable speaking into this like recording, you can feel free to comment it or something.
Or contact us at our emails. We drop them below, but we're going to send probably a follow-up email afterwards. So yeah. Anyway, yeah. Thank you everyone for coming, and yeah, I love what everyone had to say. I learned so much.
Yeah, I learned so much from y'all too. Again, if you have not joined H.O.P.E, please do so. We are such an open community, and regardless of your prior experience, we have a place for you, whether in performance or even leading. We designed H.O.P.E with the desire to give you guys a chance not only to perform but also to lead through being a piece lead / producer for our episodes. And you can simply express interest on our Google form, tinyurl.com/joinhopepiano that I linked into the chat, and it's also on the slides. So yeah, please join us. We would absolutely love to have you.
Yeah, and it's open for everyone despite your background, experience, age, whatever it is. So, okay. Does anyone mind turning on their cameras? Maybe we could like take a picture or something. But anyways, we're gonna stop the recording now, and it was great to speak to you all today.